So, has anybody got any questions for Joe? I know that Robin had a question. Robin, did you want to come off mute and ask your question, or do you want me to read it out for you?
Oh, you can read it out, Lucy.
Okay, I've copied and pasted it. So Robert's question was, does the 9 tonnes per person average UK carbon footprint include government services and other non-household activities and emissions embedded in the imports? The average footprint for the Climate Assembly was about 13 tonnes per person last year. Per year.
So yeah, thank you, Robin. That's a very good point. It's as is consumption based, so it does include emissions embedded in imports, but it doesn't include government services. And the reason for that is that we wanted to include things that we have direct control over. So clearly we can decide what we buy, but we can't decide on how the government is going to, on things like the NHS, defence, etc. We don't cover any of them. But our full methodology is on our website, and I'm happy to put that in the link as well, where we put not only how we've constructed each of the footprints, but also the data sources that we've used as well. And our approach was very much bottom up in terms of constructing the footprint. So for example, for diet, we looked at the average UK diet and all of the components that make up an average UK diet. And that was how we have got the average diet that is the default, and then you can go in and personalize it so that it's relevant to what you actually eat rather than what the average UK diet is.
Thanks, Joe. Hopefully that answers your question, Robin. Alison Kirkbright, you've got your hand up. Do you want to take yourself off mute? You're welcome to turn your video on as well if you'd like to.
Hi. I'm going to leave my video off. I'm in the worst room in the house where I'm competing for space in my house today with everybody. But thank you for that. It was really great making it so accessible and everything, that talk. While you were talking, I was looking at your website and sort of going through some of it. And some of the questions on there, they're like either yes or no answers, whereas you might sort of do it a bit. So there was no yes, I do it sometimes type thing. And I guess that I know that's really hard to estimate, I suppose. But I felt like because I don't do some of the things 100%, so I put no.
Was there things like in the diet whether you buy organic or local or seasonal, that kind of thing?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And the reason why we haven't got that sort of sliding scale is it would make it quite difficult for us, because sometimes, I guess yes and no is binary, sometimes is very subjective in terms of, is it 10% of the time, 20% of the time. So that's the reason that we just haven't, to be honest, from a data perspective, we haven't really been able to get to that level of granularity yet in terms of asking, in terms of the questions eliciting sufficient detail so that we could give you something meaningful, if that makes sense. So with yes, no, we can. With sometimes that's so subjective that we actually felt it was just better to go with the yes, no. But I think if you want to get more detail, then the best thing would be for the diet component actually to go in and put in everything that you eat, which will it's quite yes, it definitely shows commitment to data input. If you do it, I'll be impressed. So that's definitely the best way to get as accurate as you can.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I do understand that, but yeah, thank you for that. Thanks.
No, pleasure.
We had a question from James in the chat as well. James, do you want to read it out, or do you want me to read it out? I think I'll just go for it then. So James,
I think was James talking about scope 2 and 3 carbon foot emissions? Oh yes, he has said.
Yeah,
Can we please read it out?
So he says, would the calculator include tier 2 and tier 3 footprint impacts or not, as they are significantly harder to track?
That's interesting. So James, are you meaning scope 2 and scope 3?
Yes.
In terms of, great, thank you. So so scopes 2 and 3 tend to be relevant to, or tend to be used in terms of organisational footprints, but we actually have done a lot of thinking around how a personal footprint can be relevant to that. So yes, in short, yes, we do. So in in a corporate or organisational footprint, scope 1 is basically fossil fuels burned, scope 2 is electricity purchased, scope 3 is kind of everything else. And where we've been able to, we have sort of associated that same approach with what we've done. So scope 1 is largely your gas, gas or oil that you use in your house, and then fuel that you put in the car. Scope 2 would be the electricity you use at home, and then scope 3 would be everything else. So all, goods, services, travel, that kind of thing. Although travel excluding petrol for the car, petrol or diesel for the car. But it's a really interesting point that it actually the measurement system for organizational footprints can be translated quite effectively to our own footprint, because it's generated by the same sources, albeit we consume in a different way to an organization. Does that answer your question?
I think so. It's probably a question that requires a bit more time, because it's quite broad. So I appreciate your time.
I know from an Open University point of view, we're looking to obviously scope 1 and scope 2 relatively straightforward for us to measure, and it is scope 3 where we struggle to measure it and to record it and to look at the changes and things, but as a lot of organisations do. But this, like you've said, Joe, this calculator is a really good way of doing that on a personal basis, and then perhaps we can even build that up to use that across as a method for some of the scope 3 stuff that we've not really in the past. We do travel surveys, for example, but we could use this potentially as a way of showing what is happening across the OU once we get a significant number signed up. So I think it's a good tool to perhaps help us start doing some of that.
Yeah, because that's the hardest bit to measure, usually the scope 3 for an organisation. I think for us as individuals, it's actually a bit easier because we know what we're the purchaser of all of those components. We decide which holidays we're going to book. We decide which services we're going to buy. So it is actually a bit more straightforward in that we have full overview and oversight of that as individuals. But it's about making sure that the data that sits underneath it is as accurate as it possibly can be.
Great. I think we've got a question from Sarah. Sarah Dunn, do you want to chime in?
Yeah. Camera up. Hello. Right. A contentious question. This may not be everybody's cup of tea, but the majority of red meat that comes into our house is wild game that we source ourselves. We're lucky enough in that we have that source, but is that deemed to be as bad as red meat that has been farmed?
So wild game, things like pheasant and that kind of thing?
Yeah, venison, pheasant, duck, goose.
Yeah, I mean, we would love to be able to get more data on that kind of end of the spectrum in terms of grass-fed beef particularly, and venison, which I assume would be wild venison.
Yeah,
which I'm sure would have a different footprint to farmed venison. I guess there are two answers to that. Our general approach is what's available for everybody, which, as you say, that most people wouldn't be able to access that kind of those kind of supplies. I think if we find data sources that would give us that level of granularity around what the genuinely well-sourced data around the footprint of grass-fed cattle or wild venison, we'd really like to include that. And I think it's, for us, the limitations generally are, does the data exist? I think this is not data-based, this is purely my assumption. I would have thought that venison that are running around the countryside foraging rather than being fed with, you know, additional grain and all sorts of things that have had to use land that's where the grain's been grown. I would have thought they're much more likely to have a lower carbon footprint. I think the methane emissions in terms of, you know, the belching and the farting are probably not dramatically different, although there are some really interesting experiments and studies being developed at the moment in terms of what you feed particularly cattle, and can that reduce the methane emissions that they produce. And I think that some of the initial findings are that yes, it can. So there's quite a lot of work going into that at the moment in terms of actually changing some of the feedstocks to reduce the carbon emissions through farmed animals. It's a good question. I'm sure that the footprint is lower, but we haven't actually got any data that would substantiate that. But if you come across any, please do send it to us, because we're always trying to enhance our models.
I think Jen's just got something in the chat, actually, Joe, saying that Arla have been doing some work around carbon footprinting of milk, and Yo Valley similarly. So there might be something in there, not on meat per se, but on methane. That's really useful. Thank you. Yeah, Arla, there's definitely, and there's a big, I mean, that whole area is really expanding now in terms of dairy-free cheese, and, you know, but not your sort of old school vegan cheese that I think, you know, people sometimes turn their nose up at. There's all sorts of innovation in terms of creating new types of foods that are much lower carbon impact and much better substitutes. Yeah, really interesting. So I don't know if you can, Joe, but obviously we've talked about there's over 100 steps on Geeky and kind of things that we can do, and some of them are kind of, what are some of the ones that are sort of quite quick wins that people might not necessarily have thought of? Because when I went through and did it myself, there was quite a few on there that I thought, oh, I've never even thought about that, but that would be such an easy thing for me to do. So I don't know if you just want to speak about that.
I think some of one that was a particular favourite at the beginning, which is not a planet saver, but it's always, it's kind of obvious when you say it, is put the lids on the saucepan when you're cooking. And that's one that I have to say, until we wrote the step, I wasn't particularly good at. And obviously it needs less energy because the lid contains the heat that's coming up from underneath, and also it costs a bit less. If you do that every time, your bills are probably going to be marginally reduced. The thermostat one, I touched on that. The turning your thermostat down by 1 degree. So in the 70s, we used to heat our houses to about 12 degrees in the winter on average. I remember my house being very, very cold. And now we heat to about 20 or 21. But the general consensus is that if you're reasonably active, 18 degrees is ample. And if you just notch it down by a degree, that can really make quite a difference. And, put an extra jumper on or whatever. The renewable energy one I mentioned, that is definitely one that's a really good one. And then some kind of easier dietary ones are, if you're making a stew, just reduce the amount of meat. If you're a meat eater, just, throw in a few more veg or a few, pulses or something that just, change it up a bit. And another one, which was actually the most popular step during lockdown, not surprisingly, was food waste, and just getting used to always thinking through what you've got in the cupboard, and, like simple things like pulling the stuff to the front that's a bit older, and having a quick skim through the fridge every week and thinking, how am I going to make sure these don't end up in the bin? That kind of thing it's just a habit that once you get used to it, it's actually, it just sort of becomes part of what you do, and great for saving money as well. Wendy, my goodness, you've got no central heating, and it's definitely turtleneck season time. But I think, those are definitely a bit for this time of year. Those are good ones that really just spring to mind. If you really want to go radical, the banking one is a good one to look at. But I think that's probably not the first step to try. Another good one is the boiling the kettle, making sure you only put the right amount in the kettle.
Yeah, those are really good. The saucepan lids one particularly, I've never even thought about it until I saw the step on there, and I was like, why don't I use these? I've paid money for the lids as well as the pans. This is ridiculous. And actually I do it now without even thinking about it, and like, such an easy step, but obviously every little bit makes a difference. I just wondered if, because obviously you talked a little bit at the beginning about tree planting and that kind of restorative element. Do you want to expand a little bit on that and just kind of?
Yeah, so one component that, so actually, sorry, let me step back a bit. So our view, and we align our view with the UN's view, is that we need to avoid and reduce. So avoiding is like, I was going to take that flight, but I'm not going to take it anymore. Reducing is, I'm going to, as in reducing carbon emissions, I'm going to use the same amount of electricity, but I'm going to get it from a renewable supplier rather than a fossil fuel supplier. And then restoration is the last bit, which if you can't avoid or reduce, then either planting trees, which if you're lucky to have a place you can plant, fantastic, most of us don't, but there are quite a few good initiatives, and I'll talk a bit more about this in a second, but we recommend Tree Sisters, which also has a sort of female empowerment component, which is really good. I think the Woodland Trust have just started doing some work as well about tree planting in the UK, and then forest preservation. So the World Land Trust is really good, and they try to protect vast swathes of forest in endangered parts of the world where there's a lot of felling of virgin forest. And both of those components actually can have a really big effect in terms of absorbing carbon and what's called carbon sequestration. And I think that although it's not permanent in the same way as I'm not going to take this flight is, actually the role of trees in absorbing carbon, they're by far the most efficient technology that exists at the moment for that. And I think that it's a really good step. I think what we need to be mindful of is that it's not the only part of the solution. So it's an important part of the solution, but if we don't also change the way that we make decisions about how we behave and how we spend our money, tree planting alone and offsetting is not going to fix the problem. But there's definitely, a lot of really proper scientific evidence that suggests that tree planting and forests generally are going to play a really important role in getting us to where we need to get to in terms of carbon emissions in the next 10, 20, 30 years.
Yeah, I suppose I know that there was one colleague who asked me about some organisations that do tree planting because his family lives in America, and so he said, well, I can't never see my family, so obviously it was kind of a trade-off for him of, okay, well, I'll do some restorative work instead by tree planting. Yeah. And one of our academics actually that works in biodiversity has commented to say that trees are not the only answer. Grasslands and wetlands also outperform trees in carbon sequestration. So that's really
fascinating. I'd love to discuss that more. Actually, that I might see if we can connect offline, because I think, the role of nature in getting us, through some of the challenges that we have and helping people understand that better, I think is really important.
Yeah, definitely. I don't know if this is one for you then, Jo, or it might actually be one for David. But Grace has asked, what about general garden planting? Do you know some good examples of plants or planting behaviours other than trees that can act as good carbon sinks? So that might be one for David if you don't know off the top of your head, and we might have to put Grace in touch with David as well.
Yeah, I would say no is the short answer. I mean, trees are definitely where we've focused our attention. As an enthusiastic gardener, I'd say there are definitely a lot of insect plants that are loved by insects that can play a much broader role in terms of biodiversity, and making sure that you plant out in terms of what's going to provide the sort of support structure for wildlife to be in the garden. But that's a bit different from the role of carbon sequestration.
Jen has just
Jen
has just said that there's a brilliant film called Kiss the Ground about the potential of soil and other, not just trees and things like that. So that might be one that we can put on the Yammer group or something to share as well.
Yeah, and there's been some really interesting research recently into how organic farming and the soil from organic farms is much better at sequestering carbon because the soil isn't as degraded, and the better the soil, the more it's able to absorb carbon.
Smashing. Sam, did you have a question yourself?
It was only following on from that, really, in that the tree side of things and the preservation of existing forests and things like that is quite a good way as well, isn't it, of increasing your geeky score when you've done obviously other measures, because I'm obviously looking at ways of how I can beat Lucy at the top of the leaderboard. That's obviously the most important thing to come out of today. So once everyone gets on board with this and you've done a lot of the measures, it is quite interesting to see that that does have a reasonable impact. And with Christmas coming up, I know we touched on Christmas earlier. If you're stuck for gifts, I looked up and it wasn't, I was expecting it to be a lot more money to help preserve an acre of rainforest or an acre of old woodland or whatever. And it wasn't huge money. We were talking kind of £100-ish. So with Christmas coming up, it's just something to bear in mind. And if you've got any other things on Christmas or gift ideas or places to, whether there's some stuff on that on Geeky as well, I know. So I just recommend everyone to get involved with it, really.
Yeah, it's so much of it's about sort of getting the information at the time that you're ready for it, isn't it? Because actually, thinking about low impact presents when nobody's birthday's coming up and it's not, it's the middle of summer, it's kind of, well, I'll think about that in the future, and then of course you forget about it. So it is about coming to it at a time that you're thinking about making a particular decision. And we definitely find that because of the way that we tend to change, as behavior change and changing our habits is something that tends to happen quite gradually. So there might be some sort of external trigger, like David Attenborough programs or something like that recently, that make us think, right, okay, I've got to do something. I need to find something that I can do because this has concerned me so much. Or it might be a conversation like Jen was saying earlier about, your family might trigger something that start you thinking about it. Your kid learns about it at school and comes back, and I think it's about seeing this as very much a long-term game, long-term path, that we're not going to suddenly wake up one morning and have a sustainable lifestyle. It's something that happens gradually, and there'll be some times that certain steps are going to be okay or great or inspiring, and other times it'll be like, no way, that one just doesn't work for me at the moment. And it is about just kind of embracing that, I think, and accept and being like cool about that. We can't do everything immediately, and some of the time some of them are always going to be like, no, that one just doesn't work for me, I can't do that one.
Yeah, I love that. And I think this is one of the reasons why I love kind of Jen's mantra of sustainable-ish, and one of the reasons why I love Geeky is because there is that kind of feeling that you don't have to wake up perfect one day. You can chip away at it slowly in manageable chunks until, you think, oh, well, I'm much more sustainable now than I was 3 months ago or a year ago. And I think that's what's really important here, isn't it? It's that, progress, not perfection, as we were saying earlier. You can't be perfect and it all falls to pieces in a week's time. It's better to kind of chip away at it and keep making positive steps. So thank you very much, Jo. I think we'll probably draw this session to a close now then. Just so everybody knows, on the Go Green Yammer, which I'll pop a link to in the meeting chat in a second, we have pinned the post at the top about Geeky. There's also the Geeky link up in the chat for this meeting as well, so hopefully you can find that. And I've also just made a thread on the Go Green Yammer group because there's loads of really brilliant ideas coming out of today's sessions. So hopefully that means that we've got somewhere where if everyone just wants to jump on there and pop them on, and then anybody that thinks, oh, that was a brilliant recommendation for, I don't know, plastic-free loo roll or whatever, hopefully it'll be on that thread. So thank you very much for joining us, Jo.